Growing up abroad from a young age, I did not spend much quality time with my grandparents in India. My father, who was an MPhil scholar in the UK, had tied the knot and built his career there. In the meantime, my grandparents resided with my father's elder brother in Surat, India. Upon marrying my British mother and gaining UK citizenship, my father settled permanently in the UK. As a result, our visits to India, which were already infrequent, occurred only once a year. Sadly, with the passing of both my grandparents in 2007, our visits dwindled even further. Over time, the demands of our busy lives led us to cease visiting India altogether. 11 years later, in 2018, my father felt a sudden urge to return to his homeland. The primary reason behind this decision was the illness of my uncle, who had been diagnosed with liver cancer. Although aware that this trip wasn't for leisure, a profound sense of joy and excitement filled us nonetheless. After completing all the necessary preparations, we boarded a flight and arrived in Mumbai. Even though I was only 7 years old during our last visit, a sense of familiarity enveloped me as we landed there. Upon our arrival at the airport, my cousin warmly welcomed us, and together, we made our way to my uncle's residence. They had relocated from Surat to an apartment in Mumbai a year after my grandparents' passing. Despite the emptiness that now defined our Surat home, I still had a profound yearning to revisit it and reminisce about the cherished moments spent there. Therefore, after spending approximately a week in Mumbai, I sought permission from my parents to travel to Surat by train. Following a lengthy journey of about 3.5 hours, I arrived at the place that held numerous childhood memories for me. Taking a cab, I proceeded directly to our farmhouse, which had remained closed for nearly a decade since my relatives vacated the premises. Despite my father and uncle no longer residing there, the decision was made not to sell the farmhouse, given that it held memories of my grandparents. However, after their death, it stood empty and securely locked, rarely visited by anyone. Stepping back into that farmhouse after a decade abroad was like revisiting a long-forgotten chapter of my childhood. The individual who tended to the house warmly welcomed me and handed over the keys, allowing me to explore its interior. In my recollection, the farmhouse stood as a grand structure surrounded by a picturesque garden, adorned with the flowers and vegetables my grandma lovingly cultivated. To my dismay, the current state of the farmhouse presented a stark contrast. It had transformed into a disheveled and unkempt space, overrun by weeds with not a single flower in sight. The absence of the once vibrant garden filled me with a deep sense of sadness. Perhaps it was a figment of my imagination, but the moment I entered the garden, I saw something unexpected. My grandmother tending to the plants and carefully picking vegetables into a basket. Startled, I moved towards her, but in an instant, she vanished, leaving me standing alone amidst the weeds and autumn leaves once more. Although a desire to enter the house welled up within me, the unsettling vision of the garden gave me a pause, instilling a sense of fear and reluctance to venture further. Yet, dismissing it as mere delusion, I strolled toward the veranda and gently pushed open the familiar creaky door. Inside the house, dust particles danced in the faint light, gradually settling on furniture draped with sizable pieces of cloth. The once vibrant house was now immersed in darkness and an eerie stillness that terrified me. The atmosphere within was stale, carrying the weight of memories and the faint aroma of old wood causing nostalgia to wrap around me. The living room welcomed me with a silence, occasionally interrupted by the faint creak of the floorboards. As I looked around the room, my attention was drawn to the open door of my grandparents' room. Puzzled about who might have left it ajar, especially when all the other rooms were securely locked, I made my way towards it. Each step I took reverberated through the entire hall. Upon reaching the door, a terrifying sensation grappled me as I beheld a surprising sight. Seated on a rocking chair by the window was my grandfather, gazing outside where my grandmother was tending to the plants. Trembling with fear and convincing myself that it was merely a delusion stemming from the nostalgic emotions I was experiencing, I instinctively covered my mouth and turned around. Fearing the eerie sensation lingering within, I contemplated leaving the house to shake off the unsettling feeling. With determined strides, I hastened towards the door. However, my progress was abruptly halted by the unexpected sound of footsteps resonating from the floor above, shattering the prevailing silence and leaving me frozen in place. Paralyzed and incapable of movement, I strained to discern the source of the sound, initially attributing it to the aging structure of the house. Yet, my certainty wavered when a sound of cough accompanied the footsteps, dispelling my earlier assumption. Reluctantly accepting the inexplicable, I could not shake the persistent feeling that my grandparents' presence lingered in the house long after their passing. The feeling of a supernatural presence in the house sent shivers down my spine, creating a mix of fear and bewilderment. As these thoughts raced through my mind, a photo frame resting on the dusty table near the main door abruptly fell, as though an unseen force had pushed it. With each passing moment, the fear within me intensified, prompting me to sprint towards the entrance, eager to escape the unsettling atmosphere. However, what happened next left me in profound shock, etching a lasting fear in my heart. Upon reaching the main door, which I had left slightly ajar upon entering, I discovered it firmly closed. Initially attributing it to the wind, I attempted to open it, only to be shocked when I discovered it was securely locked. With fear intensifying in my heart, I exerted increasing effort to rotate the lock, yet it stubbornly refused to open. My hands trembled as I retrieved the keys from my pocket and attempted to use them, only to meet with failure. In that tense moment, the resounding voices of my grandparents echoed in my mind, imploring me not to leave them. This drove me to desperation, and I began striking the door with my fists while being unable to call for help because of the shock. Suddenly, the deafening commotion caught the attention of the housekeeper standing at the gate. Hastening to the door, he swiftly unlocked it. Relief washed over me as I dashed out of the veranda, leaving the garden behind. Perplexed by my mental state, the housekeeper inquired about what happened, prompting me to recount the entirety of my experience. Advising me not to dwell on it too much, he attributed my current state to the flood of memories triggered by every nook and cranny of the house. Additionally, he disclosed a recurring issue with the front door's lock, noting that he too had encountered similar challenges many times. However, in spite of his reassurances, I could not shake the feeling that this wasn't a mere delusion, but rather a message from my grandparents calling us back. It felt as though they desired me to stay, their unseen presence persisting even when invisible to others. With their voices resonating in my mind, I turned for a final glimpse of the house before departing, resolved to persuade my father to renovate it for our future visits to India. Behind me, the farmhouse stood in silence, an enigma of the past. Despite trying hard, I could not shake the feeling that the echoes of my grandparents' memories had lingered, casting shadows that blurred the lines between reality and the supernatural. Despite my initial skepticism about the existence of supernatural beings, the events during my visit reshaped my perspective. While acknowledging the possibility of error, as my parents and siblings didn't encounter anything unusual during their stay at the house, the profound connection I shared with my grandparents compelled me to believe in the authenticity of my experiences. The fact that I witnessed things others could not dismisses any notion of mere delusion. Upon returning from Surat, I found myself in a state of profound disturbance and strongly advocated for the renovation of the house. Thankfully, my father shared a similar sentiment and promptly visited the location the following week to initiate the renovation process. This way, before departing from India, we undertook a comprehensive renovation of the farmhouse, completely transforming the weedy garden into a tidy and vibrant space. With my uncle's consent, my father leased the property to his longtime friend, who occupied one portion and assumed responsibility for its upkeep. Since then, our visits to India have resumed their regularity, reminiscent of times past. However, the impact of that specific visit lingers profoundly in my psyche. Perhaps it's a quirk in my psychology, but every time I return to that place, an inescapable sensation envelops me. The distinct feeling that my grandparents are still there, joyous at our return, and reluctant to see us depart.